Hi, welcome to Train Signal. My name is Bill and this lesson is installing SharePoint Server 2013. Well, it's time, gang. It's time for us to go ahead and get our hands on SharePoint and start installing that software. And I know we're all excited, but before we go ahead and we do that, I want to take a few minutes, and I promise I'll be fairly quick, but I want to take out a few minutes before we go ahead and start installing to talk about farm topologies. Now, our SharePoint basically is composed of three server roles: our web server role, our application server role, and the database server role. Our web server role is fast, it's a lightweight server, and it responds to the user's requests for web pages. It hosts those web pages and web services and the web parts which are necessary to process the requests that are served by the farm. It's also going to go ahead and direct requests to the appropriate application server, which brings us to the application server role. Our application server role runs some of our application services. Services like search. Now, we haven't talked about application services yet, but we will. Throughout this course, we're going to spend a lot of time with application services. We're going to go ahead and configure them and work with them. Things like our user profile service, our managed metadata service, search service. All of those things are run by the application server. The application server does not serve up content to our users like our web server does. Now, depending on the size of your SharePoint farm, how many users you have, and how many service applications you have running, you may need to separate those service applications onto separate application servers, which is certainly possible and done all the time. And our last server role is the database server. And quite obviously, this is where our databases live. And again, depending on how big your databases are and how many you have, you may need more than one database server. Now let's take a look at some of our typical farm topologies. We have the single server, one-tier deployment. This is where we have one server which hosts all three of the server roles: the web server, the application server, and the database server. This is typically used for development and lab testing, and we'll talk a little bit more about this in just a few minutes. The next topology we want to talk about is the multi-server two-tier deployment. Now, in this situation, we're actually going to separate out our database server. We're going to put our SQL server on its own separate physical server, and we will combine the web server role. And you may hear the web server also referred to as the front-end server. We will combine that along with our application server role on the same machine that's running our SharePoint. It'll be combined on one SharePoint server. Now, this is actually what we're going to go ahead and do in this course. We are going to create this two-tier deployment. We have a separate server for our SQL and one server which will host our web server and our application server. And we'll talk more about this again in just a couple of minutes. Now, we also have a multi-server three-tier deployment. And this is where we separate all three of our server roles: the web server or front-end server onto one machine, our application server onto another, and our database server onto yet another physical server. This situation is ideal in larger deployments of SharePoint. I believe Microsoft says somewhere in the neighborhood of 10 to 20,000 users. Now, of course, you can grow from here. You can add failover servers, you can add redundant servers, you can break up and have multiple database servers and multiple application servers as your farm gets bigger, and depending on how many users you have and how many sites and site collections that you have, all of that grows, and SharePoint is really great about being able to scale your server farm. Now let's go ahead, let's take a few minutes and let's go back and talk about that single server deployment. Now, you might already know, or you might have guessed, that a standalone installation is done entirely on a single server. You have your SharePoint and your SQL installed in one individual machine, and it is only meant for development and testing. This was never meant to be a production environment. It's only there so that we can go ahead and play around with SharePoint do some testing. It's great in an educational environment, in a lab setup, or you may not have access to several servers or a big server with lots of RAM that you can go ahead and spin up virtual machines on, but it's going to be very, very limiting. Some of the reasons why you don't ever want to use this in production are: one, it's not scalable. You cannot add additional servers in this type of installation. So if you want to grow that server farm, you won't be able to. You also have limited storage. 10 gigabytes for each database. And you might think, well, 10 gigabytes is okay. I'm not going to do a lot with it, but trust me, you're going to grow out of that 10 gigabytes really fast. And the standalone installation will be installing SQL Server 2008 R2 Service Pack 1 Express, a very light version of SQL. And lastly, you have no domain service, no domain accounts, no user profile service. Now, the user profile service is what gives us things like our My Sites and lots of really cool social capabilities in SharePoint, especially in 2013. There's a lot of really neat new features that rely on that user profile service. Remember, standalone installation is great for testing, for lab, but never, never, never for a production environment. Now let's go ahead and let's talk about a server farm installation. We're going to create our server farm, and we're going to have an individual server for each one of our products that we are going to use. So we will have a server for our domain controller, a separate server for our Exchange server, a server for our SQL server, a server for our SharePoint server, and optionally, an Office Web Apps server. Now, the Office Web Apps server, of course, is not necessary, but it is a really nice feature, and we're going to go ahead in this course and install that Office Web Apps server on a separate server. So we have 5 different individual machines. Now, I will tell you, in our case here, some of these are virtual. Domain controller, the Exchange server, are virtual machines, and the Office Web Apps server is going to be a virtual server. But I have an actual SQL server and an actual SharePoint server, 2 individual boxes. That plus my host machine here that I'm recording on, and I actually have my laptop. So I have 4 big heavy-duty computers running here in my office, and as you can imagine, at times it gets very warm and very loud. But I suffer through it because I love you guys so much. Now, one of the advantages of Server Farm is it is scalable. At any time, we can go ahead and add more servers as we need them. We can continue to grow this server farm as our SharePoint infrastructure gets bigger, our company gets bigger, we begin to do more and more things with it, and we need more space. It's very simple to go ahead and add servers onto our farm at any time. All right, gang, the time has arrived. It's time for us to go ahead and start our SharePoint installation. So give me just a second, and we're going to switch over to our SharePoint server and get this thing going. All right, we're back on our SharePoint server, and as you can see, we are signed in as our SP admin again. And let's go to the desktop, and you'll see, yes, indeed, we are on GMSP-13, our SharePoint server. We've already got our disk in. Let's go ahead and let's kick off the splash screen. What the heck? Let's start there. You know, the boys at Microsoft went out of their way to make a nice splash screen for us. We might as well use it. And let's go down to Install SharePoint Server. Click there, and we'll have to wait while the setup prepares. Wow, that was very quick. Now it wants us to go ahead and find our product key, so give me a second while I put that in. There we go, and we can continue. And we will accept the terms of the agreement. We'll accept the license, continue. And this is what I was just talking to you about. It's going to ask us, do we want to go and do a complete setup, create our server farm, or a standalone version? Now, as you see, we only need to use Server 2008 R2 SP1, but we are using SQL Server 2012, just because it's the latest and greatest. All right, so we're going to leave it here on complete and choose Install Now, and there is our installation progress. Now, we're going to be prompted throughout this installation process to go ahead and add in some information. We're going to be prompted to do quite a few things. And I'm not going to make you sit here and wait while this goes on, so we will pause the recording, and I'll be back in just a few minutes. Hello again, and here we are at the first pause on our way. We're getting prompted to run the configuration wizard, and as it says, to complete the configuration of this server, you must run the SharePoint products configuration wizard. What do you say? Do we want to? Well, yes, of course we do, and that box is already checked, because if we didn't, why would we be here? So we'll go ahead and click close. All right, in order to continue on, we are going to need the name of our database server, which we have, and the username and password for that database access account. And remember, that was our SP SQL that we went ahead and created in a previous lesson. Let's go ahead and click on next. Everything looks good in here. The following services may have to be started or reset during the configuration. Not a big surprise. IIS, SharePoint Administration Service, and the SharePoint Timer Service. Do we want to allow the restart of these services if required? Well, yes, of course we do. Now, connect to a server farm. If we already have an existing server farm, and this is what we talked about just a few minutes ago, and we were going to add another SharePoint server, we can go ahead and we can do that at this point. But we are creating a new server farm, so we're going to check that box. Let's go ahead and let's select next. Now, our database server. Our database server is called GMSQL-12 and the database name, and we will leave it at the default, SharePoint_config. This is where we're going to go ahead and specify that SP farm service account that we created as our database access account. And if you remember, when we added that SP farm, I told you that it was automatically going to get those security roles, those additional security roles and login on our SQL server. So, globalmatics/SP farm, and we put in the password. Choose next. At this point, we're going to specify our farm security settings. What we need to do is create a passphrase, and this is going to be important later on if we choose to add additional servers running SharePoint to our server farm, our SharePoint farm. So we're not going to use it because we are not going to add any additional servers at this time. But were we to, at a later point, we would need to know what this passphrase is. So when you create it, put it somewhere that you can find it when you need it. So let's go ahead and choose next. Now we want to go ahead and configure our SharePoint Central Administration web application. This is the port where the Central Administration application is going to be. And this number here, 21113, is just a random port number that SharePoint generated, and you can leave that, or you can go ahead and create your own. Now I'm in favor of creating my own simply because it's going to be easier to find and distinguish from if I need it later on. So I'm simply going to, for our purposes here, something very simple and easy to remember, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then we'll go ahead down and look at our security settings. By default, it is set to NTLM, and that is what we are going to use. But you'll see that we can also go ahead and use Kerberos. Now, I will give you a little bit of a tip. If you're going to use Kerberos, get your Kerberos up and running first. Set up your SharePoint with NTLM. You can always go back later and change it to Kerberos. But if you work at it this way and things aren't working right with your Kerberos, you might run into a really difficult time trying to get it to all play nice. So get your Kerberos working first and then go ahead and change it back. So we'll leave it at NTLM. We'll choose next. And this is just a little bit of a check. We're going to make sure our database server is correct. The name of our database. Do we want to host the central web application here? There's the website, and you'll see there is the port that we just specified. NTLM looks great. We're going to go ahead and select next. All right, and it's at this point we are going to go ahead and pause our recording as SharePoint continues on with the installation. So I'm going to pause here. We'll be right back. This could take a while, so you might as well take a little lunch break at this point, or at least go to the coffee shop, something. Don't just sit here and watch that green bar go across the screen. You'll drive yourself nuts. All right, I'll see you in a little bit. Well, hey, everybody, welcome back. Well, as you can see, our configuration was successful. Hooray for us. That is always good news, isn't it? So, like it says, we need to go ahead and click Finish to close this wizard and launch our SharePoint Central Administration website to continue configuring our SharePoint installation. All right, how about that? So let's go ahead and let's do that. We will finish. All right, now I actually went ahead and I paused the recording there because it does take a couple of minutes for this to go ahead and get up and running. So if it seems to be taking a little while, don't panic. I just sped up the process for us. We get this window that's, do we want to make SharePoint better? Do we want to participate in the customer experience improvement program? I'm going to say yes, even though this is simply a lab setup. It's not a production environment. Still, I'd like to go ahead and send that information to Microsoft because, someday down the road, all of that information they gather may help us out. So we'll go ahead and click OK. And here we are at our Central Administration website. Well, that's a good thing. This means that up to this point, we've done everything right. When we got here, we know we're on the right track. We're greeted with a great big welcome, and we have a question. How do you want to configure your SharePoint farms? Well, there's two ways to do it. We can use the farm configuration wizard, or we can configure our farm manually. Now, if you have a lot of experience with SharePoint, you're a seasoned SharePoint administrator, you've installed SharePoint maybe 2010 many times, or maybe you've even started working with 2013 a bunch of times, and you're comfortable with PowerShell, you're probably going to want to go ahead and do this manually all by yourself. And to be honest, that's a really good way to do it. It lets you configure the things exactly the way you need them right from the get-go. But let's be honest, if you're watching this course, you're probably not a seasoned SharePoint administrator. You're here because you want to learn. And if you're not comfortable with PowerShell, you're going to have a lot of trouble doing this manually because yes, there are wizards that you can use for the service applications. Individual service applications can be done one by one manually using wizards. At least most of them can. There are some that there's no other way to do it but with PowerShell if you don't use the farm configuration wizard. And all of that can get very complex and very confusing very quickly if you're not comfortable with PowerShell, if you don't understand all of that, if you're not experienced with it. So, what we're going to do is we are going to use the farm configuration wizard. It's there for us. It does a pretty good job, but I'll be honest, the farm configuration wizard is not the best way to do it. And if you are a seasoned SharePoint administrator and you're watching this, you're probably yelling at me right now saying, don't tell them to use the farm configuration wizard. All right, calm down, guys. The farm configuration wizard isn't that bad. The farm configuration wizard's biggest problem is that it makes a lot of assumptions about the way you want to go ahead and set up your service applications. And, a lot of the times those assumptions may not be exactly what you want or what you need. But it's not a big deal, and especially for us, because we're going to use it as an educational opportunity, it's very cool for us to be able to go back in, once everything is set up, look at the service application and say, you know what, this is not going to work the way I want it. It's easy to delete them and then reconfigure them using those wizards or PowerShell, depending on which ones we're talking about. And we can go into more detail about them, and I can show you all the steps and everything that you need to do in order to get some of these things up and running. So we're going to go and we are going to use the farm configuration wizard, and to do that all we need to do is click on that big button here that says start the wizard. So we will click there, and there we are on our services page now. Now look over here, it says that the services require an account to operate, and that's best practice for security. You want to have a separate service account for these services. Now, if you recall, in a previous lesson, we already created some service accounts. It was our SP Farm, the SP Admin, and the SP SQL. We're going to create another service account now. We're going to need to go back to our domain controller, and we're going to create a service account for these services, and then we'll come back here and add it as a managed account in SharePoint. So let's go ahead and take a pause while we move over to the domain controller. All right, we're back at our domain controller, and let's go ahead and open up Active Directory users and computers, and we'll go to our users folders and create a new user. And we're going to create that SP service account. I'm going to call it SP SVC. And like I said before, it doesn't matter what you call these accounts, just so long as it's something that you remember. I like to make it something that's obvious, something that somebody else besides me might be able to figure out. So to my way of thinking, SP service sounds pretty good. So we'll select next. Add that password. And again, probably not the best thing security-wise. Password never expires, but for my purposes, I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. Let's choose next. Finish. Now take a look. There it is, SP service. That's great. All right, we'll finish up here at our domain controller. All right, and we're back here at our services page, so we need to go ahead and add in that service account that we just created. All right, let's go ahead now. We're going to take a look at these services. There are quite a few of them. Some of them are familiar to you if you use SharePoint 2010, and there are a few new ones, and some of the old ones have some new features. We're going to go ahead and go back to the slides for a few minutes. I'm going to highlight a few of my favorites, and then we'll go ahead and take a look briefly at all of them, and we'll select the ones that we want. So let's go ahead and let's head back to our slides. All right, the first one we want to talk about is our access services. Access services have changed a little bit. We no longer have the web database. We can now go ahead and use access apps, which are new in SharePoint Server 2013. You can build these using the Access 2013 desktop client. You can create them, edit them, manage them, link them to your SharePoint, and view them directly from the Access app in SharePoint. Now, the Access services also still handle the web databases from Access 2010 and SharePoint 2010, but the web database as a template is no longer there. All right, the next one I want to talk about is my favorite, the Excel Services application. And Excel Services are pretty much the same as they've ever been. They are a shared service, and they allow us to publish Excel 2013 workbooks onto our SharePoint server. You can then edit them, manage them, secure them, and go ahead and view them in your browser using the web app, or also go ahead and open them on your desktop, assuming you have Excel installed on your local machine. Excel Service is always popular, always one of my favorites. All right, the next one I want to talk to you about is another new one, another one of my favorites, and that is the PowerPoint Automation Services. PowerPoint Automation Services, like I said, is new to SharePoint 2013, and it is another shared service that provides unattended server-side conversions of presentations into other formats. What does that mean? That means you can now take your PowerPoint presentation and in SharePoint convert it to a PDF or other file formats in PowerPoint. How about that? Take your old PowerPoint PPTs and turn them into the new PPTX format. Another great service application, and another one of my favorites, is the Managed Metadata Service application. And basically, it makes it possible to use that managed metadata and share content types across site collections and web applications, creating a term store. And we're going to spend a lot of time with the Managed Metadata Service application in a future lesson. So hang in there, and we'll get a lot more detail about it. All right, and the last one I want to highlight, and again, one of my favorites, is the User Profile Service application. It has undergone a few changes to make it a little bit easier for us to configure and work with from SharePoint 2010. And the User Profile Service, like it says, stores information about users in a central location. This allows us to have our My Sites. It allows us to use social computing features, lots of great new features that we have available to us in SharePoint 2013. And we will be spending a lot of time with the User Profile Service application again in a later lesson. All right, let's go ahead and let's get back to central administration and talk briefly about some of the other service applications. Okay, we're back at central administration, and we want to go through the rest of this list. Access Services 2010. We're going to uncheck that because we don't have any older databases, but Access Services 2010 will allow us to go ahead and continue to work with our Access web databases from that older SharePoint installations. We're creating a brand new SharePoint farm. We don't have any Access 2010 databases, so we don't need that service. Access Services we already talked about. App Management Service, really cool new way of working with SharePoint. The SharePoint App Store, where we'll have developers go ahead and create useful SharePoint apps that you can go ahead and use with your SharePoint. The Business Data Connectivity Service, in a nutshell, it gives us access to line of business data systems. This is not one that we will be using either, so we're going to uncheck that. Excel services, we already talked about. Lotus Notes connector, we are not going to be using Lotus Notes. We use Exchange, so we don't need that one. Machine translation service. This is pretty cool. It's probably not something we're going to use, but it doesn't take up much space or resources, so I'm going to go ahead and leave it there. This allows for machine translation of documents in other languages. But again, remember, just like any machine translation of languages, you will lose things like context. It's not perfect. It's still probably a good idea to have somebody who is fluent in that language check it out and make sure that everything is okay. The Managed Metadata Service we've already talked about. The Performance Point Service Application. Now this is a really cool service application and one that I hope we will be able to do an entire course on entirely. We're not going to use this in this course. We don't have the time. Like I said, this can be a whole course, but this is really cool stuff. This is dashboards and all of that kind of stuff. Analytics, BI, really neat things that we can go ahead and work with. And like I said, hopefully we'll get another course just on this for you. All right, PowerPoint conversion services, we already talked about that. Search service applications. Search has undergone a huge change. If you're familiar with SharePoint 2013, you remember we had Fast Search, and that was only available as a separate license in SharePoint 2010 Enterprise. It is now built in to SharePoint 2013. How cool is that, gang? We're going to have all those Fast Search features right here out of the box. We don't have to pay more for them. We don't have to go through and configure them separately. It's all going to be right there, and we will spend a little bit of time using that later on. Secure Store Service, again, closely tied with our apps and app management. State Service, and just like it says, provides temporary storage of user session data, very important. We do need to have that. Usage and health data collection. This is going to, just what it says, lets us know the health and the status of our SharePoint farm. User Profile Service, we went ahead and talked about that already. Visio Graphics Service. Visio, very cool. There's a lot of really neat things now that we can do with Visio and SharePoint. Again, maybe that'll be another course I can do at another time, but we are not going to use that today, so we're going to go ahead and turn that off. The Word Automation Services, pretty much the same as it always has been, allows us to go ahead and view our Word documents in our browser. And the Workflow Service Application, and just like it says, it goes ahead and allows us to connect SharePoint to an external workflow service. And that is another thing we're not going to be dealing with in this course. So we'll turn that one off. And lastly, I skipped Work Management Service Application. And like it says, this service provides basic aggregation across work management systems. And that is one that we want to go ahead and keep. So we've got our services selected. Let's go ahead and choose Next. And working on it. This shouldn't take long. Well, we've all heard that before, and this is going to be a point where I am going to pause the recording because this could take 10 to 15 minutes, and you don't want to sit here watching this little thing spin around for all that time. So I'm going to pause, and we'll be right back. And welcome back. Here we are at Create Site Collection, and that's another good sign. We didn't get that screen that says something went wrong. Boy, I hate when that happens. That is just such a bad feeling. It's like, oh man, what did I do wrong? Well, this is where we will go ahead and we will come to create a site collection, and we can go ahead and create our first site. And I know everybody's anxious to do that, but you know what, gang? I'm sorry. We're not going to do that right now. That's going to be another lesson. We're going to go ahead and we're going to have an individual lesson on creating site collections and individual lessons on creating sites. So make sure you go ahead and check those out. But before we go, because we're pretty much done, our SharePoint is installed. It's up and running, and now everything is just tweaking and getting everything just the way we like. But before we go ahead, we're going to switch over here to Application Management, because I want to show you our service applications. And here we are. We're going to go down here to Service Applications, Manage Service Applications, and take a look. There we are. There are all of our services that we installed, all of our service applications. We see our access services, app management, Excel services, machine translation, managed metadata. Oh, I thought we turned that off. Oh well, I guess we must have selected it after all. PowerPoint, search, secure store, security token service. You don't remember that one, do you? That's one of those things that I was telling you about earlier. There wasn't an option to manually or not manually select. It wasn't one of those things that we could check. If we would not have done the farm configuration wizard, this would have had to been run strictly with PowerShell. All right, so we have our state service, usage and health, user profile, word automation, work management, etc. So everything is looking good. Let's go ahead and let's go back to our central administration. There we are. Looks pretty good. All right, gang. Well, that's it for this lesson. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you next time.